One last thing I wanted to not to forget is we are very, very happy and feel very welcome to be here in Garage, because Garage was instantly, for being a place of discussion and a cultural space, instantly enthusiastic to welcome us. And now all words to Martha to learn about the Pritzker Prize and the human impact of architecture.
Great, thank you. I think I'll just sit, okay? Yeah. Good afternoon. It is certainly a pleasure to be here. First of all, I would like to thank the Friedrich Neumann Foundation and the Garage for their generosity in hosting this event. It's really quite a privilege to be in a wonderful building like this, and certainly to be with you. Second of all, I would like to apologize for not speaking Russian. You can hear my American accent. I speak English. I also speak Spanish, but unfortunately those are the only two languages that I feel I have command of. So please bear with me with the English, and I will try to make my comments concise and clear, because at the end, I think one of the most interesting aspects of having a forum such as this is the ability to have some dialogue. So as I mentioned to my hosts, another positive aspect about being an American is that you feel that you can be very open and very honest. So any questions that you have, feel free at the end, and I will certainly try to answer them with all sincerity and all frankness. As you can see, the titles change slightly, but I like this word, Starchitects, and I did want to tell you a little bit about the Pritzker Prize. And I've been asked to speak about the process of selecting the architect or architects following the criteria of the prize, which is about built work and service to humanity. The second part of my talk will focus on the phenomenon of Starchitects, their presence in society, who promotes them and why, the impact on public discourse, and I will try to suggest some of the real challenges facing the profession of architecture. But before we begin, I have a little, not exactly a test, but who's a Starchitect? And how did this, and let's see a little bit about that. Who's the Starchitect? Left hand or right hand? Who's the Starchitect? Exactly. Do you see a similarity? Who's the Starchitect? And who's the Starchitect? Well, Brad Pitt is certainly a supporter of architecture, as he's done in New Orleans, but the designer and builder in this case is Raphael Moneo. So, as you know, there are lots and lots and lots of prizes that have been developed and are developing every day in the field of architecture. But let me tell you a little bit about the Pritzker Prize. The prize was founded in 1979 by Mr. and Mrs. J. Pritzker. Now, if you know anything about the Pritzker family, they are business people. They made their fortune first in the field of the hotel business with the Hyatt hotels. They also had many other companies. And I think in that philanthropic tradition of the United States, they had for many years been giving back to the community, especially in the field of education and libraries. And they were approached in 1978 by Carlton Smith, who was sort of a Renaissance man, nothing really special. He didn't have a special position, but a Renaissance man from Illinois. And J. Carter Brown, who was then the director of the National Museum in Washington. And they went to the Pritzkers with this idea of founding an architecture prize. And let me tell you that they had already gone to J. Paul Getty first, and Mr. Getty said no, he was not interested. But the Pritzkers said, well, yeah, this sounds like a good idea. Now, why did they do it? Part of it was this spirit of philanthropy that prevails, and of course, tax laws in the United States also support that, as well as people who are in one field like business may be very interested to become a force in another field like culture, and they find that they can do this by supporting initiatives such as a prize. And the purpose of the Pritzker Prize is twofold. It was established in '79 to recognize built work, in other words, buildings that are completed, that embody the art of architecture. So looking at this creative, the individual talent, the human contribution through architecture and seeing the artistic part of architecture. But the second part of the prize has to do with service to humanity. And here you see the words that were established in '79, and they have not changed since then. They have always remained the same. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But why is this prize such a big deal, and why do so many people know about the Pritzker Architecture Prize, but perhaps don't know the winners of the RIBA Gold Medal, or who perhaps don't know what is the Premium Imperiale, which is a prize given in Japan for several arts, but also including architecture. So this article that was published on ArchiNet, why is it such a big deal? Well, it caused me to think about it. And I think one thing has to do with the timing. In 1979, there was not a lot of attention given to architecture in the public press. There wasn't a lot of debate in public forum about architecture. So it was a ripe time, and I think people were interested. It was a time that people wanted to talk about what was happening in their cities, in their communities, so the timing was probably good. And the second reason has to do with this coining of the slogan. And as much as I try to find out who invented that slogan, I can't find out who the author is. But how smart to say the Nobel Prize of Architecture. Everybody knows right away. And why did they say Nobel? Well, part of the selection process is similar to the Nobel. The Pritzker Prize does have a purse. $100,000 US dollars is associated with the prize. Back in '79, it was a lot of money, but it certainly is not as much as the millions that go to the Nobel. But I think the most important thing is that it conjured up an image in the mind of people of something very important and something very serious. So that was the first thing. The other thing, as I mentioned, the founders of the prize. The founders, the Pritzkers, I believe that they understood the value of architecture. And here are two images of the Hyatt Hotel in the Peachtree Center, it's called, in Atlanta, Georgia. And this is from the '70s, designed by the architect Portman. This was the first time that any hotel anywhere in the world had a central atrium and had elevators that would go up and down in the atrium that were glass enclosed where you could look out. And I'm sure if I asked many of you nowadays, have you ever been to a hotel that has a large atrium and has visible elevators? I'm sure everyone here would say, yeah. And this was the first. This became wildly popular, and it really, this type of idea for a hotel has been extended throughout the world. And I think Mr. and Mrs. Pritzker, the founders, understood that architecture is an art that could really change our perception of the world and change our experience. As I mentioned, other purposes have to do with their understanding of contribution to their community. And why not say this? It also has to do with becoming recognized. We all like to be recognized in our field, and naming a prize after your own last name guarantees that you will be talked about and you will be recognized, and hopefully in a positive way in the press and other media. What are the other strengths of the Pritzker Prize? Well, it is an open nominations process. Every summer, I send out about 200, 250 emails. Used to send out letters. Thank goodness we have technology and I don't have to do it by hand and go to the post office. But I ask people, former laureates, professors, critics, bloggers, museum directors, anyone who I can think of, who is a lover of architecture, knows something about architecture, and could have an opinion that would be helpful to me or the jury. And I basically say, who do you think should be nominated for the Pritzker next year? And also I say, who do you think the jury should be looking at for future years? What young architects are practicing in your community, in your country, or who you feel are worthy of being kept on our radar? And then the second part are unsolicited nominations. And this means that any licensed architect anywhere in the world can send me an email and say, I would like to nominate so-and-so. Now, I have to tell you, I never ask a person for their registration number. I don't ask for a copy of your diploma. So if there's anyone here in the audience who would like to suggest someone for next year's prize, I will give you my email. You can find it on the website. Send me your suggestion. I can tell you, if you say you are trying to suggest that it be your brother, your wife, your son, your daughter, I may look a little more carefully. On the other hand, I can also tell you that one architect before my time as executive director, and I've been with the Pritzker organization since 2005, but one architect called my predecessor, Bill Lacey, and said, Bill, I'm calling to find out about the nomination process. Can an architect nominate his or herself? And my predecessor said, yes, of course. He said, well, I want to nominate myself, and my name is Gordon Bunshaft. Lo and behold, he won the prize, not the next year, but in the future. So you can also nominate yourself if you think you meet the criteria. Another strength of the prize, it is based on real work. In contrast to many architectural prizes, the jury never selects a laureate based on photographs. A majority of the jury members must have experienced real buildings by the architect or architects in question in order to be able to support fully that nomination. And as one jury member said, we do it this way because there are a lot of great photographers around the world and not so many great buildings. The other thing is the jury travels together a week every year. We go to a region of the world. Now, many people think that the Pritzker jury sort of jumps on a plane and drops down one day in Moscow and one day in Beijing and one day in Tokyo and then finally ends up in Los Angeles. We don't do it like that because the purpose of the trip is for the jury to develop their vocabulary, to develop their understanding of architecture together, to see the context. One single building devoid of its context really doesn't tell the whole story. So we go to a region of the world. And I try to use my powers of going incognito. We don't tell people, oh, we're coming to Moscow next week, please prepare things for us. We try to do things quietly, and we don't ask architects to accompany us from the local region, or we don't ask authors of buildings to accompany us, because it means that the jury has the freedom to express their opinion openly without being influenced by the wonderful architects who may have undertaken the design. The prize has just enough celebration and ceremony, and here you can see an example on the left when Sejiman Nishizawa won, and the ceremony was in New York City, and on the right was just May 20th in Tokyo, the 3 Catalan architects who won the prize this year in the presence of the Emperor and Empress of Japan. The celebration is an evening private event of about 300 to 400 people where there's a dinner and some speeches, but it's not the big deal. The big deal are the laureates and their work. And in the same vein, the organization of the prize, I always like to say it's lean and mean. That means we have one full-time person in charge of communication, myself, who's only part-time. I have a real day job as dean at IE School of Architecture and Design. And we don't have a board that has a lot of complicated bureaucracy. It's just very direct. As long as I have my computer and telephone and can be reached any hour of the day and night, then things seem to work. Finally, the greatest strength, I have to say, lies in the jury of experts. It's interesting to note that this is the jury of the past year who selected the 3 Catalan architects. We change slightly from year to year. Jurors are expected to serve for a minimum of 3 years. That means that they're very serious. They have to come back the next year, face their decision. It also gives some continuity in the procedures that we follow, so they're not being altered. There is stability, but there is change. So next year, 2 members will leave, and Wang Shu, who is a former Pritzker laureate from China, will join, as will Andre Correa do Lago, who is the Brazilian ambassador in Tokyo. And he is also a curator and an expert on architecture, especially of the 20th century Brazil and Niemeyer and Da Costa. This is a kind of a funny chart, but the most important thing are not the names. But if you look at the jury over the years, you can see that they're not all architects. People have been involved in publishing or curating. They've been practicing architects, and they've been patrons, philanthropists, or business people. And I can tell you that having Ratan Tata, who trained as an architect but is in the field of business, is really quite rewarding. And if you'll allow me, I'll tell you a little story about Stephen Breyer, who is a member of the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, Stephen Breyer did not train as an architect, and he came on the jury a few years ago. And I remember when he joined, he telephoned me, because part of my role is to try to help jurors and to be of service to them. And he said, Martha, what am I going to contribute to this jury? I have no experience in the field of architecture. And we talked for a while, and I said, well, your points of view as representing the public. You were the client for the courthouse in Boston as well as other places. You understand the relationship between architecture and public service. That's an incredible gift to bring to the jury. And he asked me for a reading list and read everything that I sent to him. It's incredible. But at the first jury meeting, one of the first ones, he was really rather quiet. and didn't say too much. And the jury debates, they are very opinionated, but the way the jury works is they have to convince each other of their arguments. They have to convince each other of the reasons and the reasoning behind the prize in order to support one candidate or another. And the jury had been going around and around and around, and they couldn't seem to come to a decision. I mean, we take as long as we need, but they couldn't come to a decision. So finally, Justice Breyer said, you know, I think what we should do is go around the table and just in 1 minute, each of us should summarize our position on these important matters. Summarize your position and let's see what happens. So they went around the table. Everybody still had different opinions. And then we looked again at Justice Breyer. We thought the words of wisdom, he would say, oh, this is the answer. And what he said was, now I think we should take a minute and think about what the other person has said. And then after about a minute, people started looking at each other and smiling. And it was obvious. Once they had listened to each other, it became clear and the decision was made. So that's what the jury does. Now, as you can see, I think that the prize is really strong. I think that it's one that is still relevant, although just before we talk a little bit about Starchitects, I would like to say one thing about prizes in general. The Pritzker Prize follows the model of experts making a decision, bringing together information, but in the end, the jury makes the decision. If we look at how society is changing now, we see that in other fields through the shared economy, there is a lot of emphasis on ideas, regardless of where they come from, and ideas that are able to solve problems. So I think some of the most interesting current prizes would be ones like the X Prize, like trying to come up with inventions to solve societal problems, be it a robot, be it a system for mobility, where the idea is the important thing, not the person. That said, I do think that the Pritzker Prize, because it is evolving and it still evolves, it does have value. And the way it's evolving has to do with the message that it tries to communicate to the public. If we look at the beginning of the winners, they were probably more single-dimensional people. They were probably famous men who did iconic buildings. If we look at more recent decisions by the jury and the jury citation, we see that the message becomes more complex. When they talk about Glenn Murcutt and sustainability, when they talk about Shigeru Ban and using common materials for temporary buildings, for being able to respond to disaster relief. If we look at Wang Shu, the Chinese laureate, and how he uses traditional materials in a modern way, or if we look at the 3 laureates from this year, Aranda, Pigem, and Vilalta, and how they are enormously local and conscious of their context when they undertake any building, but that architecture has the possibility to reach out and be universal and respond to almost any human emotion or any human being through their emotions. So I think in that sense the prize is trying to evolve, and I hope it continues to do that. But let's see if it's contributed some negative things through Starchitects. So I'll just flip through the winners, and if you think in your mind, there have been to date 43 laureates. This is the 39th year. Next year will be our 40th anniversary. But as we go through these, a lot of people criticize the Pritzker Prize, saying, oh, it's just Starchitects. See who in your mind you think are Starchitects of these winners, if you can keep count. And I'll ask you at the end. I know how many I think are Starchitects, but see what you think. And I'll just go really quickly through. I think it's also interesting to try to figure out, were they Starchitects before they won the prize? Did they become Starchitects after? Or did they fade into the background? How many think that how many would say there are 5 or less Starchitects? 18. 5, okay. 5 to 10, anybody? About 10. 10 out of 40 some. 18, anybody want to say more than how many? 12. Okay. Anybody 25 to... No, not so many. Okay. So what is this excuse me? 22. Oh, generous over there. So what is this concept of Starchitect? Well, if we look at magazines or blogs or even academic journals, there's not a lot of consensus about where that terminology came from or what year it came into being. But there is consensus in most cases that it is a negative label for some architects. For those architects who seem to relish the spotlight, like to become celebrities as movie stars. And Starchitect is a favorite word of outspoken commentators who use it to mock architects. And they mock them because their flamboyant buildings are thought to be more about fashion and money than function. And the implicit argument goes that architects consider themselves artists, somehow in possession of a truth, able to create something so unique in a place that certain normal rules and practices should be suspended for them. Many see this behavior of architects as selfish, stating that fantastic buildings, iconic forms, and playing a power game are merely to enhance their own standing and stature. And critics say that buildings produced by Starchitects are image conscious and photography friendly, but not much else. So if we look at the literature and articles about Starchitects, it's probably fair to say about 90% of use the term in a derogatory manner for architects calling attention to themselves. And why do I think that architects probably suffer more than other professions from fame? Certainly we like athletes who are famous. Certainly we like actors and actresses. But I think the reason architects suffer is because of the nature of architecture. And what is the nature of architecture in my mind? Well, if I could just share with you an anecdote from Stanley Tigerman, an architect in Chicago who was a supporter of the museum that I worked at there, the Art Institute. He made the comment that the more functional the art is, the less it is valued. And the more useless an art is, the more money it commands, the more influence it commands, especially in a museum. So in my museum, the drawings department and paintings department were the rich departments. They were the ones with the big staff, and they had a lot of power within the museum hierarchy. Below that was sculpture. Below that was jewelry. Below that was textiles, because you could sit on it. But below that was architecture, because you could walk on it. And so architecture, because it approximates this utilitarian side of the artistic scale, I think that function and the utilitarian part put it more in the public realm and make it more susceptible to criticism. And maybe that's the way it should be. Now, this term Starchitect, it's believed that it came into being in the 1980s. But we have to remember that this phenomenon of looking at architects and turning them into stars, this is not a new phenomenon. This happened a long time ago. Just to cite a couple examples, let's go back way before the Beaux-Arts Ball in New York. But if we go back to the 17th century and we remember Italian sculptor and architect Bernini, he was certainly a celebrity and a self-promoter. He promoted himself with patrons, with possible clients, and was always talking about his great art and architecture. Or we could remember Frank Lloyd Wright, the 20th century American architect. Just think of Frank Lloyd Wright with that cape and cane and the long white hair. And then if we look at his personal life and the flamboyancy and well, it's almost like a novel. I'm not sure if a romance novel or a mystery novel, but certainly his life is like a novel. In the 30s, at the Beaux-Arts Ball in New York, architects dressed up like their buildings. And we have people dressed up using the Waldorf Astoria on their head, or the Chrysler Building in the center, as you can see, or the Museum of the City of New York on the far right. And also, if we go to blogs and publications nowadays. This is from, I think it's from Dezeen or one of the popular international architecture blogs. They're again poking fun at architects, from Peter Eisenman on the left to Danny Libeskind on the right, and the way that they're wearing their buildings. I call your attention to the fourth one, David Adjaye, because I believe you'll have an exhibition here in the garage that will be opening soon, and you can see if you agree that he's putting a building on top of his head or not. And if we look at the covers of Time magazine, of course, you know Time is the popular American magazine from 1923 with a U.S. readership at that time of about 20 million people and a global readership of 25 million. Well, from the period 1923 to 1999, 15 architects appeared on the cover. The most intense period of time for this magazine was the 60s, when during that decade, it may not seem like much, but there were 6 covers devoted to architects. And of course, here we have Frank Lloyd Wright on the top left. The bottom left is Le Corbusier or Bucky Fuller in the middle. And the last on the lower right is Philip Johnson in 1979. He's holding the AT&T building that he designed for Manhattan, New York City. And this was January, and he won the Pritzker Prize that year. Now, without going into the role of Henry Luce, who was the director of the magazine, he was clearly a proponent of architecture, and most of the covers happened under his tenure. He did 2 things. Sometimes he supported architects who were already recognized or consecrated, and other times he brought out less well-known architects to give attention to him. or to them. The Pritzker Prize does the same thing. Sometimes it calls attention to the promise of the future, and other times the Pritzker Prize, as in the case of Frei Otto, the German architect, calls attention to someone at the very end of their career. Going back to time, just to give you an example, Frank Lloyd Wright had 236 articles devoted to Frank Lloyd Wright in the 20th century. But nowadays, and I would say since the 80s, there have only been small articles devoted to architects or designers, and usually it has to do with something related to innovation or a special new building, but not a monographic article on the overall work of that architect. Now, why is there an increase in this debate of Starchitecture nowadays? I think it has to do with 5 factors: globalization, technology, the rise of prizes like the Pritzker, but also the role of critics in this discussion and clients. Globalization, it became popular, well, if we look at globalization, around the time that Frank Gehry built the Guggenheim in Bilbao in the 90s, this gave rise to the idea that architects could travel anywhere in the world and undertake buildings with a signature style. And if we look at places like the Mideast or China, there are many, many Western transplants in those countries. And there seems to be a backlash against this attention that's being granted to architects undertaking that type of building, which is, well, I would call it a transplant to another place. Technology is important because technology has freed architects from the limitations of traditional design methods. And while technology is often seen as a tool, it is not just a tool, but it does open doors and assists in new designs and allows architects to undertake forms and solutions that were not possible in the past, many in a quicker way, using new materials and trying out new experiments. And I would argue that to the public, sometimes these new possibilities are shocking, and therefore the architects seem to be caught in a message of trying to call attention to his or herself. What about critics and prizes? Well, during recent decades, architecture has become the subject of intense public interest as never before. In part, this may be due to prizes such as the Pritzker, but it has to do a lot with criticism in the general press. It has to do a lot with the way we communicate using the internet, blogs, and other methods. And for example, if we look back at Herbert Muschamp, who was a critic in the New York Times around 2000, he used his position to support a certain few architects and to pass judgment critically on a certain few buildings, especially iconic ones. Now, I think that clients have an enormous role in the making of Starchitects or not. And the works of Starchitects are not necessarily ill-planned or poorly detailed or badly constructed. And often the work by Starchitects, these that you see here and others, are really trying to take into account the function, the context, the community. However, the demands of certain clients to make a powerful statement by a certain date through their building is something that calls into question good architecture. Also, the belief that one building can turn around the economy of a city or assure that the city's stature will rise to the top because of the creation of a new symbol in the form of a monument is clearly mistaken. Now, just to give you an example, in an article in the Wall Street Journal in 2013 talked about New York and said that residences in buildings designed by big-name architects tend to sell for more than similar units in buildings designed by lesser-known architects. So, if you hire a famous architect, you could make more money if you're a developer. The same thing was found in another study that was undertaken about commercial office buildings. Those buildings designed by Pritzker Prize winners and by architects who also possessed the AIA Gold Medal, the American Institute of Architects Gold Medal, found an increase in the rental price. So, in other words, the economic argument is one that many times clients make, at least in their own mind, but I would say that it also extends to politicians. Politicians like architects that have already a brand name, that are accepted, and that have a proven track record, whatever that might be. And I found that in processes where I have participated in designing the selection process or a competition, when you talk to the client, they often look for an architect who's already designed X number of museums, or I want an architect for this library who's already done 10 libraries. So what does this mean? Or they may say, I want a Pritzker Prize winner, because they think it reduces their risk. And rather than being a client which is ready to look to the future, many times it's easier for them to look to the past as they make their decisions. And finally, architects, at times, they themselves want to become part of this star system, because, in fact, that means that they don't have to participate in competitions, or they're not as vulnerable to competitions for certain types of work. And we see this, that many times the same architects are on the short list of many competitions, or we're calling on the same people to do the major buildings of our cities. I'm not sure if you agree with these classifications. These are not mine. These come from someone who has written an article on this already. So, in conclusion, who really creates a Starchitect? An architect, the popular press, clients, the Pritzker Architecture Prize or other awards, the public? Well, of course, the answer is all of these agents. But I think there is another question, the bigger question that remains. Are Starchitects good or bad for architecture? Well, for me, the answer is somewhat like architecture itself. It's a complex answer that has more than one part. Precisely in this age of sound bites and quick information, delving deeper into understanding and going deeper when making judgments is not always easy. So therefore, how do we evaluate a building or a proposal for a new public space or a new urban strategy? Well, it must be looked at from several perspectives, and recognizing that the answer will probably not be black and white, not famous architecture or unfamous architecture, not Starchitect or architect, but multiple shades of gray. Starchitects are positive because we talk about architecture, because the broad public feels it can participate in the debate, because architecture is a difficult profession and the day-to-day effort should be adequately recognized. Starchitecture is negative because it obscures the real purpose of architecture. It often becomes a brand or a symbol of money or political power. It is used as a vehicle for others to make money or to gain votes. The real purpose and challenge of architecture, in my mind, is to create safe, comfortable, useful, beautiful buildings that are an expression of the best of our time and place. It is to research, test, and invent new and better ways of building, to respond to our new patterns of behavior, whether they are new ways that we undertake work, shop, or move around the city. Architecture is to help construct cities that are open and democratic. Architects and architecture should be responsible stewards of the environment in our approach to the built environment. If Starchitects could make these profound arguments and take strong stands on certain positions, then they would certainly do a service for all. If they could educate clients, whether they are private persons, developers, or governments, that our cities and therefore our future is long-term and a very serious propositions, then Starchitects will have undertaken an immense service to us all. Thank you.
Большое спасибо. Please, yeah. So.
Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое, Марта.
Thank you, Martha.
И все-таки я бы хотела.
And still, I would like to clarify something.
Significant contribution to humanity, значительный вклад в человечество.
So this significant contribution to humanity, what you have as a slogan,
устоявшаяся концепция.
Is there a certain concept that the jury supports? For example, is this the concluding part of your talk, the way architecture should be? So, what does jury think about this significant contribution to humanity?
Well, that's a great question. The jury begins its discussion every year by talking about what has happened during that year, what is the state of architecture, and that gives them a first approximation as to what is important for humanity. It changes from year to year. It is not one thing. And that's because the jury is made up of individuals and they see the world from a subjective point of view, and they also try to see it from an objective point of view. But it changes from year to year. As I mentioned, when the jury selected Glenn Murcutt, service to humanity was sustainability, was the natural environment, was touching lightly on the earth. This year, the question was more about in a time of confusion that we see about Europe, nationalism, countries' borders, immigration. Does architecture have a message? And I think that if we look at the three winners this year, the service to humanity is probably an example of collaboration, of collaborative work. I think another value in this year's winners has to do with the integration of context and architecture, landscape and architecture. So in other words, it's an attitude of seeing architecture as part of a bigger world, not just something that an architect does in an isolated manner. And then finally, in the jury citation, if you read that the words of the jury where they say, architecture, the laureates architect this year gives us hope that architecture can be both local and global. It can be very much related to individual identity. It can be related to a specific place, but it can also be universal at the same time. So it can be respectful of the individual, but it can also break down boundaries. And for this year, for the jury, that was service to humanity, that example. I don't think we will ever see a more precise definition on the part of the jury as to saying, no, service to humanity is building 500,000 housing units. No. They will probably each year change the discourse slightly, but they will more now than I'm sure, more now than 30 years ago, they will look at the broader impact or the broader message of architecture than they did in the past.
То есть действительно есть такая тенденция.
So there's this trend. Pritzker Prize has been there for 40 years. So is there this trend towards the impact in humanity? Does it have a bigger weight? For example, if we take a look at Alejandro Aravena, who became famous, of course, he was building many beautiful things, beautiful buildings. But he became a winner with his concept of social housing, and it's a very famous project. Or Shigeru Ban, as we know, he became famous with his temporary architecture, which you need when something happened, like a catastrophe or a disaster, flooding or tsunami. But this definition, contribution into humanity, you have had it from the very beginning. So what can you say?
Yeah, the contribution to humanity at the beginning, I'm not sure how they interpreted it, except perhaps as an example of quality architecture and creating public space. I can only speak to the time that I've been there, that the debate about the role of the architect, the social contribution is much greater now. That said, I have to say that the jury is ferociously in favor of quality in architecture. They will not choose an architect who does the most, for example, sustainable buildings, zero energy consumption, if that is the only value, if they are not doing something more in terms of architectural quality. I think the jury tries to analyze architecture from a multifaceted perspective. Architecture is not one thing, and that's why it's difficult. It has to do many, many things at the same time, and it has to be beautiful and a product of creativity as well as collaboration and technical prowess and many other things. But the quality of the architecture is always going to be there, will always be there. And where that debate about the social role or the contribution, I hope it increases and becomes, if not increases, becomes more explicit. But I'm not sure what direction it will take because I have no voice and no vote on the jury. So.
Но вы это все анализируете.
But you are analyzing all this, so you can give your analysis because you make sure they comply with procedure. And it was really interesting when you explained how the jury worked. And you said that the jury has to make a common decision. It's not the majority vote. You have to convince everybody so that you could make one decision. It's fantastic, and it seems a right thing to do. So what was the most difficult decision? when it was the most difficult to make this decision, this single decision?
Yeah.
If you can think of anything like that.
It's hard to remember. I think I can't reveal specific conversations, but I can share maybe two anecdotes, and I don't want people tweeting this, please. But when you think of the members of the jury, sometimes the most powerful architects are not the most powerful jury members because they're not the most eloquent, or maybe they're not team players. So it's really important on the jury to be a team player. The dynamics of the jury is one where if you have a spirit of collaboration, then we can all win. If you come on the jury and you have an opinion that you want to defend, you become a negotiator. And when there's negotiation, somebody always loses. So I would say probably the most difficult jury meetings were those where people either couldn't formulate their opinion in a convincing way, or they came in with an attitude of negotiating rather than collaborating. I would say that all the jury meetings are passionate. There may be one other. The second comment I would make is if you look at the winners, how it goes up and down in terms of age, this sometimes is, the jury questions this. They don't look at geography. They don't usually look at age. They don't look at gender, which I wish they would sometimes, but they don't. But sometimes there is the debate if a candidate is young, should they give the prize to an older person who's more consolidated, or should they give it to a younger architect? And when the short list comes down to that, they sometimes talk about that. And so you can see one year Frei Otto wins, another year Wang Shu wins. So the ages go up and down. But I think that's the beauty of the prize, because it gives us both messages. It gives us one of looking at great examples, but it also gives a challenge to younger architects, younger in their 50s or 40s, that they have a great responsibility for the future. More than that, I can't say.
Как вам кажется, вот этот метод
So this method, 100% solution, is it applicable somewhere else apart from Pritzker Prize? Because you were a member of different competitions jury. So in what sphere this principle could be applicable?
Yeah, I think ideally it would be great in every sort of important decision that's made. The reason it happens in the Pritzker and it doesn't happen other places has to do with the commitment over time and the relationship among the people on the jury. To give you an example, if I'm on a jury where I will see the people once in my life or once in 5 years, maybe I don't live in that city, so I come in, make a decision, then leave. Well, if it's a bad decision, I'm not invested in it. It's too bad. And I can fight or defend a position and support something. But I think the beauty of the Pritzker is people have to come back next year. They have to see each other 2 or 3 times a year. And they have to find that common ground because they have to live together. And as much as I would, I wish there were a way in other competitions to instill this long-term commitment. Architecture is a long-term endeavor. From the time a decision is made until a building is built, until it's torn down, decades, could even be hundreds of years. So when decisions are seen as one afternoon or one day, and that's all, it doesn't do justice to the architectural process. So I think that clearly, if we're talking about large communities, to have everybody agree on everything is probably impossible. And on architecture juries, which are extremely diverse and happen only over one day, it's very difficult. I think the key is, on one hand, making sure the objectives are shared, and second of all, letting people know that their participation in a decision goes far, far beyond that one day or that week or that year. Their decision has enormous impacts in the future. And so when you put that weight on somebody's shoulders, you can hope that they take it seriously.
So this personal responsibility and reputation is essential here.
Yeah.
Да. Еще я не буду очень долго говорить, хотя у меня, конечно,
I'm not going to talk for a long time. Even though I have many questions for Martha, I'll give a chance to ask questions.
В 1979 году
But you said that in 1979, when the Pritzker Prize was established, you said that architecture was not really a focus of attention in the public eye. So it was the time, it was the right time when it appeared. And then you showed the covers of the Time magazine, and they were quite many. And you said that it was related to the editor-in-chief, because he loved architecture. So, you also mentioned that Frank Lloyd Wright had 230-something articles in press, whereas you can't find such a thing now. So now, since the 70s, has there been more attention to architecture in public sphere? And if yes, why?
Yeah, I think the example of Time magazine is an example of the architect as hero. And it's an example of the individual creator being highlighted on the cover. I think the great change nowadays, and I hope from 80s, 90s, probably 90s to the present, is that architecture is spoken about more in daily newspapers, but even more than that, through technology, through blogs, through Twitter, through Facebook. It's something that more and more people can talk about and do talk about. So if there were 236 articles on Frank Lloyd Wright in the 20th century, there's probably 236 articles about Zaha Hadid in 1 month or 1 year throughout the world. So I think just in terms of press and media coverage of architecture, it's a whole lot more. And I also I can't speak to every context. But I also think that that the public living in cities demands much more of a voice now than probably at other times, demands more of a voice in new projects, in new initiatives that are undertaken in cities. But this, I don't have facts and figures. I haven't looked at that to know if that's true or not. But I would imagine that it is.
But are these famous architects that were Pritzker Prize winners ready for this public involvement?
I will try to answer that, and it's not to avoid the question. I think that any architect, when commissioned to undertake a building or a public space, any good architect wants the maximum input about the history, the climate, the functions, the desires, the hopes, the political situation, the culture, the potential users, and even the future users, or how things may change. If an architect says, I will design this building, no, don't tell me anything, I know everything, you don't want that architect. Pritzker winner or non-Pritzker winner, run. You don't want that architect. So, I think any architect worth his or her salt, any architect who wants to do something of quality and service, of course they're going to listen to many voices, but to many clues from the place. I think they will.
Okay, dear friends, does anyone have any questions for Martha?
First of all, I do not know who's going to win next year the Pritzker Prize, so don't ask me that.
Okay, my question was just really short. I want to ask you, are there lots of Russians nominated on Pritzker Prize?
Okay.
Like, what about us?
Okay. The nominations come to me, and I usually in the fall I present a long list to the jury so they can know what the public is thinking. I never tell them who has made the nomination. I never tell them how many people have suggested so and so. I can't tell you exact numbers, basically because I don't remember, but anyhow, even if I could, I wouldn't tell you.
Yeah.
What I have seen in the past, I would say in the past 5 to 8 years, many more names from Eastern Europe, many more names from Southeast Asia. The area where we don't, and as much as I reach out, have not had success is Africa, northern or southern, sub-Saharan Africa. But yes, there are more from Eastern Europe, and I hope after today there'll be a whole lot more.
Oh yeah, thank you. And the next short question is, do you have a favorite Russian architect?
If I did, I wouldn't even say. You know, it's because I have to be neutral for the jury.
Oh yeah, I see.
And just as I protect the jury from people sending books and gifts and making phone calls and things like that, it's not my place to speak in favor or against anybody, because it could be understood that I was trying to influence the jury. So
no way.
No way.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Also a short question: how do you select the jury members?
Excellent question. This is this is not trying to escape from the question, but it's an art, not a science, and within the Pritzker organization, there's a lot of consensus building. So when someone says that they have to leave the jury because of time commitments or for whatever reason, health or whatever, then the jury they sort of say, well, this was a business person, or this was a critic or practicing architect. Who could we look to fill that gap? We also we want diversity from geography. So, for example, Young Ho Chang left, and from China he's Beijing, and Wang Shu has joined. So the jury first makes sort of a list. We talk it over with Mr. and Mrs. Pritzker. Now it's Tom Pritzker, the son of the founders, and his wife. They often have a lunch or they meet this person at some place. Then they ask me to call that person to see what type of time commitment do they have. Jury members must travel, they must attend the ceremony, and they must attend the face-to-face meetings. We do nothing by phone or Skype. Jury members do not get paid anything. Their travel is paid, and that's all. So it's a big commitment, and it must be for 3 years. The current jury members and the Pritzker family look for people who don't have an agenda. They look for people with an open mind. And we really don't want people coming to say, I'm getting on the jury so I can make sure my brother-in-law wins the prize. It's people who are very open to learning new things. Takes a long time. When somebody leaves, it could be a vacancy for a long time. The bylaws say we need between 5 and 9 people. Young Ho Chang submitted his resignation 2 years ago, and he was asked to stay on until we could find somebody who was appropriate. So it's a mutual decision, and everybody has to agree. And we've had a couple of cases where somebody didn't work out, and after a short time they left, but that's a rare exception. Usually people stay 3 years and even more.
Yes. И еще один вопрос про работу жюри.
One more question about jury. You mentioned one case when you didn't have an architect on the jury. Do you have other cases?
Yeah. Yes, there are many jury members who are not architects. Right now, Stephen Breyer is not an architect. Peter Palumbo is...
Who are they?
Oh, Stephen Breyer is justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. Peter Palumbo was chair of the jury. He is a member of the House of Lords in Great Britain, and he is a philanthropist who supports architecture. He also he also owned the Farnsworth House by Mies van der Rohe until several years ago, when it was sold to a trust. He owns Kentuck Knob, which is a Frank Lloyd Wright building in the U.S., so he's a philanthropist. Christine Freireis is director of Adas Gallery in Berlin. She just stepped down. She's been a member for a number of years. And I'm trying to think if we had perhaps an author or writers, but yeah, there have been a number of non-architects on the jury, but always people very close to the field.
Yeah, sorry, one question about architecture and power.
Yeah.
Some architects that won the Pritzker Prize have been highly criticized for their kind of relationship to authoritarian leaders. So there was this in Western media big criticism against the Norman Foster pyramid in Astana. There is the big criticism about Zaha Hadid building of this wonderful cultural center in Baku that apparently, I don't know, the buildings have been destroyed so that this big project can be realized. Do these kind of media reports or discussions also play a part in the jury in kind of speaking about the human impact of architecture?
Those particular cases happened after they had won the prize. I'm trying to recall. I think that the jury, well, two things. One, I think that the jury doesn't really care what other people think. These are 7, 8 very strongly opinionated people. Case in point, and I don't know if we want to talk about it, but the case in point is when there was the petition on change.org supporting Denise Scott Brown and asking the jury to overturn a past decision. The jury said, no, that was a past jury that made the decision. That was their decision alone. And the jury stands by its decisions, the ones it makes now. However, that said, I would hypothesize if there were an architect that were in a situation such as you mentioned, working for a regime that was somehow could be understood as illegal or immoral, I would imagine, and I would certainly hope that the jury would be extremely cautious about that. And I think they would be. They're extremely principled people. They're conscious of what's happening in the world. And especially Justice Breyer, the rule of law is something that is unquestionable. So, I don't think we'll see. I don't think we'll see a Pritzker winner working for a doubtful cause.
Еще вопросы? Хорошо, тогда еще вопрос от меня.
Okay, if you don't have questions, I'd love to ask my question.
Alejandro Aravena.
So, Alejandro Aravena.
Сказано, что особо отмечено его
It was mentioned, his activism was mentioned.
Должен ли архитектор быть активистом?
Should an architect be an activist?
Well, as we mentioned last night, I think, and this is my personal opinion, I think all acts of architecture have a political component to it, on one hand. So, yes, you must be conscious of that political component. When you're building in a city, when you're changing the territory, you are affecting not only the people who will live and reside there, but you're affecting more than that. So it does have that element. A second personal thought is I believe the role of the architect is expanding, and it should expand. We can no longer see architects as designers or builders of buildings, but they're creating our cities where we all live, and we have to live we have to live with all the implications of a city, of living together, of having a common memory, of creating a common future. So, and then the third comment I'd like to make is that the biggest global challenges facing our society could benefit enormously by the training and the skills of architects and designers. And I think Alejandro Aravena showed that by making a place at the table for architects, he made a very positive contribution to how to attack the lack of housing, especially for the most fragile economic layers of Chile. So this idea that architects are able to analyze very complex situations, they're able to bring together information from multiple sources, synthesize it, and then imagine alternatives, not one, but several alternatives, usually in 3 dimensions because we work in 3 dimensions, imagining space. This is something that politicians can't do, doctors can't do, writers can't do, teachers probably can't do. So there are not a lot of professions that can bring this all together and imagine 3-dimensional futures. And whether those 3 dimensions are an organization, a strategy, or a physical space. So in that sense, I firmly, and it's a personal opinion, I firmly believe that the social role of architecture, understanding the political nature of it, in the broadest sense of the word, is definitely an area that architects should get into. That's a personal opinion.
Еще вопросы? Ну, вы отметили отдельно, насколько, что это с вашей точки зрения важно, что Прицкеровскую премию сравнивают с Нобелевской премией.
Prize is often compared with Nobel Prize, but you know there's lots of debates around the Nobel Prize, whether it has to be a prize in literature or economy, but this prize reflects a certain agenda
в этот момент в обществе.
That is available in society.
Вот то, что в последние 3 года происходит с Прицкеровской премией,
what we have observed in Pritzker Prize in the last 3 years. So, for example, activism or serving to the society does this reflect something that happens outside of architecture, and whether it's going to be in the same vein?
Okay, that's a hard question. 2 things. One, just to respond to the first part of your comment about the Nobel Prize, and there's a lot of debate. That's great. And I hope in terms of the Pritzker, if people disagree, I hope there's a lot of debate too, because that's part of the mission, is to talk about architecture. The question about activism, that I'm not sure I really understood.
I mean, so I just can cite this about Alejandro Aravena. He has a deep understanding of both architecture and civil society, as is reflected in his writings, his activism, and his designs. So, I mean, this part. So, это важно для... Sorry. Это важно для...
Is this important?
Получается, это важно для
So
жюри,
it means it was important for the jury if they put it in their statement.
No, in that year it was important for the jury. They looked at his buildings, all of his buildings. They also looked at the housing, the half a house idea that he built. And I think that comment meant that it wasn't just the physical housing that he built, over 2,500 units. That wasn't the only value. The value was that he was able to change the system to establish a method for building low-income housing that could be replicated, which was half a house. So if you build a house of 40 square meters using a site which is closer to the city, providing the structure and the plumbing, which the residents are unable to do on their own, and then you prepare the house so that they are able to add onto it, add another floor, paint it, finish the walls, put in tiles or whatever with their own labor, or as they're able to save money. Then basically what you're doing is you're allowing people to have more than a house. It's a house, but it's an investment that they can then either sell or use as collateral. if they want to start a business. You're allowing people to become middle class rather than ghettoizing them and keeping them as lower class. And that's what the jury thought was important, not just the physical structures, but that system of changing the rules. And clearly in the case of Alejandro Aravena, that was enormously important. But if you look at the other winners of the Pritzker Prize, even in recent years, it's never the same. It's never the same message that activism is the most important thing. It's within the context of that individual and their body of work.
Да, конечно, но существует, то есть активизм.
Yes, that's true.
Хорошо, обязательно, извините. Несомненно, архитектурная ценность является
architectural value
тем, что неизменной вещью. Вопрос
is something permanent there. But, for example, architectural value without that impact in humanity. Okay, like impact in humanity without aesthetics is clear. But, for example, can we consider aesthetics without ethics?
I hope the Pritzker Prize never has aesthetics without ethics. I hope they never do that. And although I don't have a direct voice in the meetings, I don't express an opinion to the jury. As a jury, I don't vote. We have other ways to influence things. So, no, I think if you can be sure that the ethics is a part of the deliberations, but ethics in a very broad sense. It's not narrow. It's not saying, you have to start an NGO to win the Pritzker Prize. No, they see it in a very broad way, because also not every person can contribute, or not every person is in a position to do the same thing. And that depends on the individual, but there have to be different models and different ways to make that contribution to humanity.
Okay.
День добрый. В связи с тем,
Good afternoon.
смещается фокус.
Since you shift the focus of attention towards ethics,
Вы как-то начали ли по-другому думать о своей конкуренции? Понятно, что.
Did you perhaps begin to think about competition in a different way? Maybe you reinvented or begin to rethink the place of Pritzker Prize on the market of prizes. As far as I understand,
Did you start thinking about competition in the prizes?
Oh yeah. No, there is enormous competition among prizes, and that is something that I think about a lot. There's a new prize that was started at IIT, Illinois Institute of Technology, an architecture prize of the Americas. And I think in part to look especially, the Pritzker has not gone to a U.S. architect in 12 years, and I think there was a feeling that Canadian architects and South Americans were probably not receiving the credit that was due, so that this is a new prize. There is the Moriyama Prize in Canada, and it has I think it's a $250,000 purse or $200,000 purse. And so it is trying to be the competition of the Pritzker. And then if we look at, there's a prize for sustainability, and there are many, you saw from the slide in the beginning, many new prizes every day. I think the Pritzker, it is a challenge to remain relevant. The jury has to make good decisions. If they make bad decisions, then nobody will pay attention to the Pritzker, you can be sure. The public is not, they are unforgiving, and they tell me their opinion all the time. So I think it would, if there would be a prize that would substitute the Pritzker tomorrow. If you want to start one, I would say do it based on an idea or a challenge that we must face, and don't look for a personality or one person, but look for a team that can best put forward a solution to that problem, whether it is housing or an aspect of global warming or the invention of lightweight materials or cheap this or whatever. I think the next big frontier in architecture is not resting on the shoulders of one person, but it will be a global challenge that is attacked with probably an interdisciplinary team. And so that's where I would look.
Добрый день. Спасибо большое за рассказ.
Thank you very much for this talk. I have this question. For example, when jury members discuss the prize, do they consider the prize as a message that they want to get across? For example, do they discuss, oh, we should support this kind of subject, or we should say this, or we should give this definition? And you mentioned that you tried not to invite people that have their own agenda, but I know that Alejandro Aravena used to be a jury member, so we could expect certain solutions because of that.
Okay. Two comments. First, about the jury looks first at works, at buildings by architects, the quality of buildings and the message of the buildings. That is the starting point. The jury does not say, okay, this year we want to give a prize to sustainability. Who's done sustainable buildings? No, they don't look at that. They look first at the evidence as seen through buildings, and usually the most interesting buildings usually have a story behind them, usually have a deeper meaning, and that's what they look. So they look first at the buildings, and then they look at the message behind and try to explain it. And I think every decent building has to have a message. And the problem is lots of times the press is unable to explain it. They don't have enough space or enough, it's not catchy, it's not sexy to describe a big message of a building. So in that sense, that's what the jury does. The comment about Alejandro Aravena. Okay, Alejandro Aravena was on the jury, he left the jury, and after being off the jury for a year, he was selected as laureate. And there was some criticism about that. The criticism was that it was an insider's job, that it was the jury giving to their own, and there was criticism. I understand that. I understand that there was that criticism, and I think it would have been fine if the jury had waited a couple years to give him the prize. On the other hand, I would say two things. One, in my experience of accompanying the jury all the time and the years that Alejandro Aravena was on the jury, he never promoted himself, ever. He never talked about his own work, ever. He was always a jury member first. A second point, there's no benefit for the jury to appoint one of their own as a laureate because there's no advantage to that. Just the opposite, it could be seen as negative. So there's no reason, there's no favor that the jury owed to Alejandro, or Alejandro to the jury, so absolutely not. And then the third thing is what I mentioned before. The jury was convinced that it was the best decision in terms of architecture, in terms of message, in terms of the moment. So they knew that there would be criticism, and basically they said, we don't care. This is our decision, we stand behind it.
Я прошу прощения, просто это не совсем то, о чем я спрашивал.
It's not exactly what I asked you about. When I asked you about Alejandro Aravena, his interest in social architecture and in activism, he has always been interested in that. So the person with such great interest in architecture and very active position, whether he fits in this program of comprehensive analysis, independence from fashion, etc.
No, I think Alejandro does. I think he was on the jury for 6 or 7 years, and if you look at the winners when he was on there, it was a broad spectrum of winners. Clearly he's interested in social aspects of architecture, but I think he's interested in a lot of other things too. So, okay.
Спасибо. И, наверное, заключительный
Thank you, and probably my last question now.
Вот как вы считаете, премии эти кому-то интересны, кроме архитекторов?
Do you think these prizes are interesting for people outside of architects? Does it influence the society outside of architecture?
Yeah. That's a really it's the hard question you left to the end. Let me put it this way. Influence is a really hard thing to measure because it's sometimes is counterintuitive. So for example, if we try to measure the influence of the Pritzker Prize in terms of the number of articles in newspapers or television or radio, it's growing. But communication is growing everywhere, so maybe it doesn't mean anything. If we try to measure, as people have done in different studies, the impact of Pritzker Prize winners, for example, does it make architecture in a city better? They've had difficulty measuring things like that. It's easier to measure the economic impact maybe of a Pritzker winner versus a building by a non-Pritzker winner. Where I think the great value is in terms of the Pritzker Prize, I would say one is a current value and one is a hoped for future value. The current value is if the Pritzker Prize influences opinion makers, opinion makers around the world, even if that's the 500 people who come to the Pritzker ceremony and dinner, or even if that's a small number of opinion makers, if it influences them to make better cities, to undertake higher quality buildings, or to be more sensitive to some of the issues or the messages that the prize, then that's fine. I think the Pritzker Prize can influence students. I hope that it influences them with a good message about the essence of architecture, not just a formal message about copying forms of other people. That's a danger. And then I would say that my hope in terms of the Pritzker Prize is that in the area, for example, of education, of being open to public debate, that it improves and continues to improve. For example, around the time of the ceremony, there's always a lecture, a panel discussion, which is open to the public. This year in Tokyo, there were about 1,300 people who attended, mostly architects or students, but still, they have friends who are non-architects and non-architectural students. Next year, the Pritzker Prize will be held in Chicago, and I'm encouraging the Pritzker family to do it at the Millennium Park. There's the Frank Gehry designed Pritzker Band Shell, which is an amphitheater, which the amphitheater can hold up to, I think it's 5,000 people and more on the grass around it. My hope for the future is that the Pritzker Prize not only has a message for opinion makers and for architects, but also does more and more activities that allow a broad public to participate, and therefore, if the broad public participates, somehow engages in a more meaningful way in the discussion about our future environment and our future cities. That's a hope, and step by step. Architecture is a slow profession. Pushing the Pritzker is a slow profession. But I think, I'm a marathon runner. I'm not a sprinter. I'll keep going.
Большое спасибо. Thank you very much.